There is a place in the Amazon where every map has a hole in it. Not a gap caused by cloud cover, not a region that satellites have not yet photographed, not an area that cartographers simply ran out of time to label. A deliberate blank, a space that professional mapmakers, people who have dedicated their careers to the precise rendering of the physical world, have chosen, generation after generation, to leave empty. And the blank is always in the same place. The same rough coordinates, the same stretch of river and forest and shadow in the deep interior of the South American continent. And when you start asking why, when you start pulling at that thread, you do not find a simple answer. You find something that changes the way you think about maps, about the Amazon, about the limits of human knowledge, and about what it actually means when we say we know something about a place. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the world at the level where things get genuinely strange, genuinely deep, and genuinely real. Because what we are about to get into is one of those stories that sounds like it should not be true, and turns out to be more true than you were prepared for. Let us start with the maps themselves, because the maps are the first mystery, and they set up everything else. When cartographers produce maps of the Amazon basin, and this has been true for roughly 5 centuries of European mapping tradition, and remains true today even in the age of satellite imaging, there is a region in the western and southwestern Amazon, straddling the border zones where Brazil meets Peru and Colombia, and in some versions extending into the territory where Brazil edges toward Bolivia, where the detail simply stops. You will see rivers marked, because rivers are visible from above, and their courses are relatively well documented. You will see the green wash of forest canopy that tells you vegetation exists. But the interior detail, the villages, the trails, the clearings, the infrastructure of human habitation that appears everywhere else on detailed maps of inhabited territory, it is not there. The space is there, the geography is there, but the human layer, the layer that says, people live here, and this is how they have organized their presence on this land, that layer is absent. And cartographers will tell you, when you ask them directly, that this is not an accident. It is a policy, and the policy has a reason. And the reason is one of the most remarkable facts about the 21st century on this planet. There are people living in that blank space who have never made contact with the outside world. Not people who live simply. Not people who have limited access to modern technology. People who have had no contact, or who have actively resisted contact with the broader human civilization that surrounds them. People who, from inside the blank space on the map, look out at a world they have chosen not to enter, or that has not yet found them, or both. The Brazilian government agency FUNAI, the Fundação Nacional dos Povos Indígenas, which is the agency responsible for protecting the rights and territories of Brazil's indigenous peoples, estimates that there are somewhere between 100 and 160 uncontacted or voluntarily isolated indigenous groups in the Amazon. Let that number settle for a moment. Not 1, not 5, not a handful of edge cases that survived contact by accident in some remote river bend. Between 100 and 160 distinct groups, with their own languages, their own social structures, their own histories, their own knowledge of the forest they live in, living in the 21st century, in deliberate or circumstantial separation from the rest of humanity. Brazil alone. Peru has additional groups. Colombia has additional groups. Bolivia, Ecuador, Venezuela. All of the countries that share the Amazon basin have uncontacted populations within their territories. Brazil accounts for the largest number of documented uncontacted groups in the world, which is why the blank on the Brazilian maps is the most consistent and the most deliberate. But the phenomenon itself is pan-Amazonian, and understanding it requires going back much further than the current moment. It requires going back to the moment when contact began. Because the reason there are people in the Amazon who have no contact with the outside world is not that the outside world never tried to reach them. It is that the outside world reached them before, and what happened then was catastrophic enough that the surviving communities did everything in their power to ensure it never happened again. The colonization of the Americas brought diseases to which the indigenous population had no immunity: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera. These diseases moved faster than the colonizers themselves, spreading through trade networks and river routes and the ordinary movements of people, killing communities that had never seen a European face, with diseases that Europeans had evolved some resistance to over centuries. The demographic collapse of indigenous populations in the Americas following European contact is one of the largest mortality events in human history. Estimates of population loss vary widely, depending on the source and the methodology, but the range that most serious historians now work with suggests that somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century following first European contact. 50 to 90% of tens of millions of people. In the Amazon specifically, the pattern of disease spread along rivers, which were the highways of the basin, and the river-connected communities were the first to be exposed and the first to suffer catastrophic losses. Communities deep in the forest, away from the rivers, away from the trade routes, had some natural protection. The ones that survived were often the ones that were hardest to reach, the ones furthest from the colonial presence, the ones in the interior of the vast forest, where the rivers were smaller and the tree cover was denser, and the journey from a colonial settlement was measured in weeks rather than days. And after the wave of death passed, the survivors knew something. They knew, in the most direct and devastating way possible, what contact with the outside meant. And some of them, or their descendants, made a choice. No more contact. This is the foundational fact behind the blank space on the map. The people who live in that blank space are not primitive in any meaningful sense of the word. They are not people who have been left behind by history. They are people whose history includes a catastrophe so complete and so devastating that isolation became not just a preference, but a survival strategy, encoded into the culture, passed down through generations, maintained across centuries. The blank space is not absence. It is the result of a decision. But the story is more complicated than a single decision made once in the distant past and maintained unchanged. Because the Amazon is not a static place, and the pressures on uncontacted communities are not historical. They are present. They are current. They are in many cases getting worse. Let us talk about what the blank space actually contains, geographically, before we talk about who lives there and what is happening to them. Because the geography itself is extraordinary, and most people have only the vaguest sense of what the western and southwestern Amazon actually looks like. The part of the Amazon where the blank space appears most consistently on maps is not a uniform landscape. The Amazon basin as a whole covers roughly 7 million square kilometers, making it the largest tropical rainforest on Earth, the largest river system on Earth by volume of water, and one of the most biodiverse ecosystems the planet has ever produced. But within that vast basin there is significant variation. The eastern Amazon, the areas of Brazil closer to the Atlantic coast, have been subject to human pressure for longer and are more fragmented, more accessible, more connected to the outside world. The western Amazon, particularly the areas around the upper tributaries, the areas where the rivers that eventually become the Amazon itself originate in the foothills of the Andes, is older forest, denser forest, less disturbed forest. The soil under the western Amazon is different from the soil under most of the basin. The eastern Amazon sits largely on ancient, deeply weathered soils that are chemically poor, their nutrients locked up in the biomass of the living forest rather than in the ground. But in parts of the western Amazon, particularly in the Peruvian and Colombian sectors, the geological history is different. The Andes to the west have been shedding sediment into the Amazon basin for millions of years, and in the zones where that sediment accumulated, the soils are richer, more fertile, capable of supporting not just dense forest, but a different kind of forest, with different species composition and different productivity. This geological richness has consequences for human settlement. Richer soils mean more productive agriculture, which means larger populations can be supported. Which means the pre-contact indigenous population of the western Amazon was likely larger and more complex than older archaeological models suggested. This is one of the significant recent discoveries in Amazonian archaeology, the revision of the idea that the Amazon was a wilderness inhabited only by small, scattered, relatively simple groups. The archaeological evidence that has emerged over the past 3 decades, the discovery of enormous earthworks, the evidence of managed forest gardens, the ceramic sequences that indicate dense and long-standing settlement. All of this suggests that the pre-contact Amazon supported a much larger and more sophisticated human population than European observers, arriving after the catastrophic population collapse, had any way of knowing. The European explorers who first penetrated the Amazon in the 16th century described in their journals and letters huge riverbank settlements, cities even, the scale of which astonished them. Francisco de Orellana, the Spanish explorer who made the first European navigation of the Amazon from the Andes to the Atlantic in 1541 and 1542, reported to his superiors settlements on the Amazon's banks that stretched for miles, with large buildings, with roads that led into the interior, with populations that he described in the thousands. He described it with the particular mix of wonder and acquisitiveness of a Spanish conquistador of the 16th century, which is to say that he immediately thought about how to conquer and exploit it. But within decades of those first encounters, when other European explorers and missionaries came back to the same stretches of river, the settlements were gone. The populations had collapsed. The roads were being swallowed by returning forest. The survivors had retreated into the interior, away from the rivers where the diseases had spread fastest, away from the contact zones that had proven fatal. What the later Europeans saw was not the Amazon as it had been. It was the Amazon, after the catastrophe, half-emptied, reorganized around survival, in the process of forgetting its own recent past. The great blank space, the blank on the map, is in some sense the memory of that pre-contact world, or what remains of it. The people who live there now are not necessarily direct biological descendants of the large riverbank settlements that Orellana described, but they are the continuation of a human presence in that forest that is very, very old. Older than European contact by thousands of years. Older than the agricultural civilizations of the Andes. As old as the forest itself in human terms. And they know the forest in a way that nothing in the outside world's current understanding even begins to approach. Let us talk about forest knowledge, because this is one of the central things about uncontacted and recently contacted Amazonian communities that outside observers consistently underestimate, and because understanding the depth and complexity of that knowledge changes the entire frame of what we mean when we talk about the blank space. The Amazon contains somewhere between 16,000 and 40,000 species of vascular plants, depending on how boundaries are drawn and which survey you are using. Estimates of total species, including insects, fungi, microorganisms, and all other living forms, are frankly astronomical, and scientists regularly discover species in the Amazon that were previously unknown to science. The forest is so complex and so rich that the scientific community's formal inventory of it is nowhere near complete and may never be complete. But the people who live in the Amazon have been conducting their own inventory for thousands of years. Not in scientific journals, not in databases, in knowledge systems passed orally from generation to generation, in the practical education of children learning to hunt and gather and farm and navigate and heal in a specific forest. And this knowledge, the knowledge of which plants can be eaten and which cannot, which plants have medicinal properties and how to prepare them, which trees indicate the presence of particular animals, how to read the behavior of birds as indicators of weather and forest condition, how to navigate by landmarks in a landscape without visible horizons, how to farm in ways that work with the forest system rather than against it. This knowledge is in many cases deeper and more functionally precise than anything in the formal scientific literature. The pharmacological knowledge alone is staggering. Curare, the plant-derived muscle relaxant that indigenous Amazonian hunters have used on blow darts for hunting for thousands of years, is now a foundational drug in modern surgery, where it is used as a muscle relaxant during procedures, because it turned out that the indigenous knowledge of its effects was precisely correct and pharmacologically verifiable. Quinine, the malaria treatment that was for centuries the most effective weapon against one of the most deadly diseases in human history, came from the bark of the cinchona tree, knowledge of which was carried by indigenous Andean and Amazonian communities long before European science had any idea what malaria even was. Ayahuasca, the complex pharmacological preparation that combines multiple plant sources in a specific way to produce a psychoactive effect that neither plant source produces alone, which means that whoever first discovered it understood not just the chemistry of individual plants, but the chemistry of their combination, is an indigenous pharmaceutical achievement that modern ethnobotanists are still working to fully understand. These are not accidents. They are the result of thousands of years of careful, systematic observation and experimentation. They are science, conducted by different methods, recorded in different forms, but meeting the most fundamental definition of science, which is systematic observation of the natural world in pursuit of understanding that can be applied. And the communities living in the blank space on the map carry the most intact versions of this knowledge that exist anywhere in the world, precisely because they have not been subjected to the disruptions of contact that erased or fragmented the knowledge systems of contacted communities. When FUNAI or other indigenous rights organizations talk about why uncontacted groups should be protected from forced contact, they are not just making an argument about individual rights, though they are also making that argument. They are making an argument about knowledge, about what will be lost to all of humanity if the people who carry it are gone before anyone has had a chance to understand what they know. The blank space contains a library that has no physical form, written in no language that outside scholars can read, stored in the living minds of people who have no desire to share it with the civilization that previously tried to destroy them. And every time contact is forced, or happens through violence or disease or the intrusion of illegal activity, that library burns. Now let us talk about the specific mechanisms of the blank space, because the cartographic practice itself is worth examining in detail, and it connects to a much larger apparatus of protection and surveillance that most people have no idea exists. The Brazilian government's formal policy on uncontacted peoples has evolved significantly over the past 50 years and is now, in its best articulated form, one of the most sophisticated indigenous rights frameworks in the world, even if the enforcement of that framework varies considerably with the political winds and the resources available to FUNAI. The core principle, established in Brazilian law, is the right to isolation. Uncontacted peoples are not, under Brazilian law, people who have been left behind or who need to be brought into contact with modern society. They are peoples exercising a recognized right to remain isolated, and the role of the state is to protect that right, not to override it. The protection has several components. The most fundamental is territorial. Brazil has demarcated indigenous territories, legally recognized areas within which indigenous peoples have rights that supersede the rights of outsiders, and some of the territories in the western Amazon are designated specifically for the protection of uncontacted groups. The boundaries of these territories appear on official maps. The territories themselves are where the blank spaces are. FUNAI maintains what it calls protection fronts, equipes de proteção, teams of specially trained agents who work in the territories surrounding uncontacted groups, monitoring for encroachment, gathering evidence of where uncontacted communities are present, managing the perimeter in ways that minimize the risk of accidental contact, while also maintaining enough information to demonstrate to authorities in the courts that these groups exist, that they are in their territories, and that the territories require protection. These teams are extraordinary in their own right. They spend months at a time in the deep forest. They learn to read the signs of an uncontacted community's presence without making contact. The fish traps, the cleared gardens glimpsed from a distance, the sound of voices or drums heard across a river, the arrows sometimes fired as warnings when they approach too closely. They build a picture of a community's territory, its size, its approximate population, its seasonal movements, all without any direct communication. The cartographic blank is a deliberate extension of this protection logic. If maps showing the interior of an uncontacted territory were detailed and publicly available, those maps would be useful to the people who most want to penetrate those territories for purposes that have nothing to do with respect for the communities that live there. Illegal loggers, illegal gold miners, ranchers looking to expand, drug traffickers who use remote forest areas as transit corridors. All of these actors, and they are present at the edges of every uncontacted territory in the Amazon, would use detailed maps of those territories as operational intelligence. The blank space makes that harder. It is a protective omission. The absence of information is itself a form of defense. This is one of those ideas that seems paradoxical until you think it through. We live in an age that treats the accumulation and sharing of information as an inherent good. Open maps, open data, transparency. These are the values of the information age, and they are not wrong in most contexts. But there are contexts in which the withholding of information is an ethical act, in which the blank space on the map is the most honest and the most humane response available, in which adding detail would not illuminate but endanger. The cartographic blank of the Amazon is one of the clearest examples of this principle at work, and it is worth sitting with that for a moment because it challenges some comfortable assumptions. The people who made the policy of the blank space are not obscuring reality. They are protecting lives. They are acknowledging that not all knowledge should be made universally available at all times, and that the interests of the people most directly affected by information disclosure must be weighted heavily when that disclosure could harm them. In the Amazon, the calculus is stark. A detailed map of an uncontacted territory in the hands of an illegal miner or logger is a threat to the people living there. The blank space keeps them safer than the detail would. The map lies by omission, and the lie is kindness. But there is another layer to this. one that the straight policy discussion does not fully capture, and it has to do with what we can know about the people in the blank space from the evidence available, from the careful, non-invasive observations of Funai teams and researchers who have spent years at the margins of these territories, from the studies of recently contacted groups whose experience allows us to model what uncontacted life might look like, and from the occasional moments when the blank space itself reaches out in the only form it has available, which is resistance. The most famous of these moments in recent years involved what became known as the last survivor of the Rio Tanaru territory, sometimes called the Man of the Hole in media reports, a name that came from the particular feature of the shelters he built, a hole dug in the floor of every shelter, whose purpose has never been definitively established. This man lived alone in a territory in the state of Rondônia in the Brazilian Amazon for decades, the last survivor of his community, which had been massacred by cattle ranchers in the 1970s and 1980s. Funai knew he was there. Funai teams monitored his territory and found his shelters and the holes he dug in their floors, and the evidence of his hunting and his agriculture, the small plots of maize and manioc that he maintained in clearings in the forest. They observed him from a distance on a handful of occasions. And he observed them, and on every occasion when contact was attempted or when strangers entered his territory, he responded with arrows. He was not confused about what outside contact meant. He had survived the violent destruction of his community. He knew exactly what strangers in his forest represented. He was found dead in August of 2022, in his hammock, his body surrounded by macaw feathers, apparently of natural causes. He had been estimated to be somewhere between 60 and 80 years old. He was the last speaker of his language. He was the last person who knew what his people called themselves. He was the last person who knew the songs and the stories and the names of the plants and the history of a community that no longer existed, except in the single, remarkable fact of his continued survival. And when he died, all of that went with him. The language, the songs, the names, the history. Gone. Not as dramatic fire or sudden destruction, but as the quiet extinction of a last candle. His story is not the story of the people in the blank space. His story is the story of what happens to communities that are exposed to the worst of what contact can bring. But it is a necessary context for understanding why the blank space exists and why the people in it respond the way they do when outsiders approach. There have been other moments of visibility from communities that remain broadly uncontacted. In 2018, drone footage captured by Brazilian authorities showed a community living in the Javari Valley, one of the largest concentrations of uncontacted peoples in the world, reacting to the drone with bows drawn, faces painted in red and black, standing in their garden clearing, with a kind of fierce, alert stillness that the footage somehow communicated even without sound, even at the remove of a camera. They were aware, they were watching, they had weapons ready. They were not primitive people who did not understand what a flying machine was. They were people who had made a calculation about strangers with flying machines and had their answer ready. The Javari Valley is one of the most important territories in the entire Amazon for the protection of uncontacted peoples. It is a demarcated indigenous territory in the state of Amazonas, covering an area of roughly 85,000 square kilometers, which makes it larger than Portugal or Austria, and it contains the highest concentration of uncontacted indigenous groups in the world. Funai estimates that there are at least 16 uncontacted groups in the Javari Valley, though the actual number may be higher because some groups have been confirmed to exist through indirect evidence without ever being directly observed. The rivers of the Javari Valley are among the least traveled and least documented in the entire Amazon. The Javari River itself, which forms the border between Brazil and Peru, runs through territory so remote that even aerial photography has not fully documented what is on the ground beneath the forest canopy. The canopy is the key barrier to remote observation. A dense tropical forest canopy can be essentially opaque from above, blocking satellite and aerial views of whatever is happening underneath. A village of 100 or 200 people, living in forest structures and cultivating gardens in canopy-covered clearings, can be effectively invisible to remote sensing technology. The people below can hear aircraft and can watch through gaps in the canopy. The aircraft cannot see them. This asymmetry of observation is one of the things that makes the blank space so enduring. Even in the age of high-resolution satellite imaging, even in the age when Google Earth allows any person with an internet connection to look at almost any point on the planet's surface from space, the canopy of the deep Amazon maintains its privacy. You can see the green. You cannot see what moves through it. You can see the rivers. You cannot see who is in the small canoe moving under the overhanging trees at the river's edge. The forest is opaque in precisely the way that has always protected it. Now let us talk about what is threatening the blank space, because the story of the Amazon's uncontacted peoples is not a comfortable, stable situation that can be described in the present tense with confidence that it will persist. It is under pressure. It is under severe and, in many periods, intensifying pressure. And the nature of that pressure tells us something important, not just about the Amazon, but about the broader dynamics of the world in the 21st century. The most immediate and concrete threat is illegal resource extraction. Gold mining, which has expanded dramatically in the Amazon over the past decade, uses mercury to process the ore, and the mercury enters the rivers and works its way up the food chain, poisoning fish and the communities that eat them. Illegal gold miners, called garimpos in Portuguese, have penetrated deep into indigenous territories in search of the mineral deposits that the geological complexity of the Amazon basin contains. They bring diseases to which isolated communities have no immunity. They bring violence. They destroy rivers and forest. They are connected to criminal networks that have the capacity to threaten and kill indigenous rights defenders and FUNAI agents who try to stop them. Between 2019 and 2022, illegal mining in indigenous territories in the Brazilian Amazon expanded at a rate that indigenous rights organizations described as unprecedented. The Yanomami territory, one of the largest indigenous territories in Brazil, saw an explosion of illegal mining that by some estimates had more than 20,000 illegal miners operating within its boundaries by 2021. The Yanomami are not uncontacted. They are a large and well-documented indigenous nation with a population of around 30,000 people, but the crisis in their territory illustrates the scale and the violence of what illegal mining brings. And the Yanomami territory borders on territories that contain uncontacted groups, meaning the mining pressure is moving in the direction of the blank space. Illegal logging is a second major pressure. The timber of the western Amazon includes species of high commercial value, and logging operations, again largely illegal because the forests they are targeting are in protected territories, push roads into the forest interior. Roads are the most transformative force in the Amazon, because they do not just allow extraction, they open territory to further encroachment. Every road cut into the Amazon is a vector for further settlement, further clearing, further pressure on the forest and on the people who live in it. The pattern is well documented and has been repeated across the Amazon for decades. Road goes in, settlement follows the road, forest is cleared for cattle and soy. Communities that were deep in the forest find themselves at the edge of a cattle ranch. The blank space shrinks. Agricultural expansion, particularly for cattle and for soy, which is grown to feed cattle and pigs and poultry across the world, is the large-scale structural driver beneath the more dramatic headlines about gold mining and logging. The Amazon is being cleared for agriculture at a rate that has fluctuated with Brazilian political conditions and enforcement capacity, but has never dropped to zero. The satellite data that tracks deforestation in the Amazon is one of the clearest records we have of this process. Green disappearing from the map in real time, the forest edge moving inward year by year. And here is the particularly cruel irony of the situation. The communities in the blank space, the uncontacted peoples, are among the most effective guardians of the Amazon that exist. The territories where they live are among the best preserved, most ecologically intact parts of the entire basin. Study after study of satellite deforestation data shows that indigenous territories have lower deforestation rates than adjacent areas. The people who live in the forest and depend on the forest maintain the forest in a way that no conservation policy applied from outside has managed to replicate. The blank space is not just a region of human habitation. It is one of the most effective conservation zones in the Amazon, maintained not by state policy, but by the presence and the practices of the people who have lived there for thousands of years. This creates a conservation argument for protection that works alongside the human rights argument, and the combination is powerful. Protecting uncontacted peoples is not just the right thing to do by the standards of human rights and respect for self-determination, though it is that. It is also, in the most practical and ecological terms, one of the most cost-effective ways to protect the Amazon. Leave the people in the blank space alone. Enforce the territorial boundaries against illegal encroachment. And the forest they live in will be maintained by people who know it better than any conservation agency and care about it with a directness and a depth that comes from actually living there. But the conservation argument, as powerful as it is, can itself become a kind of trap. There is a version of the conservation argument that treats uncontacted peoples as guardians of nature rather than as people, that sees them instrumentally, as custodians of ecosystem services rather than as humans with rights, with histories, with stories, with the full complexity of human existence. This version, however well-intentioned, tends to produce a kind of museum mentality about uncontacted communities, a desire to preserve them as they are, forever, as a living exhibit of pre-contact life, for the benefit of the biodiversity they steward and the interest of the outside world that finds them fascinating. This is not protection. It is a different kind of colonialism, one that freezes people in a role that serves the interests of the observer. The principle of self-determination, which is the actual foundation of the blank space policy at its best, says something different. It says that the people in the blank space have the right to remain isolated if that is their choice. It also says that they have the right to initiate contact on their own terms if and when they choose. It says that the contact they may eventually have with the outside world should be on their terms, at their pace, in response to their needs as they define them. It says that the outside world's job is to protect the space within which those choices can be made freely, not to make the choices for them. This is harder than it sounds, because the outside world is not patient, and the pressures on the blank space are not patient either. Illegal miners do not wait for community decisions. Roads do not negotiate with the forest. The timeline of ecological destruction and the timeline of respectful, self-determined contact are running at very different speeds. The blank space is shrinking not because the people in it are choosing to engage with the outside world, but because the outside world is crashing in from all sides. There is a particular kind of contact that happens at the boundaries of uncontacted territories that most people do not know about, and it is important for understanding the full picture. This is the category that Funai calls sporadic contact, or peripheral contact. The encounters that happen at the edges, when members of an uncontacted group and members of a neighboring contacted indigenous group or Funai team are in proximity. These encounters are not the dramatic first contact scenes that appear in documentaries. They are often brief, cautious, ambiguous, happening at the edge of a forest where one party sees another across a river and both parties stand still for a moment, watching, before one of them disappears back into the trees. From these peripheral encounters, and from the observations of Funai protection teams, and from the material evidence of the community's presence, their trails, their gardens, their shelters, their tools, researchers have built up a partial picture of how at least some of the communities in the blank space live. But partial is the crucial word here. Partial, cautious, full of acknowledged uncertainty. Because the ethics of the blank space extend to intellectual humility as well. You cannot know with confidence what you have not been allowed to observe. You should not project onto the blank space the assumptions and frameworks of the outside world. The blank space is not a projection screen. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: the communities living in the blank space are not remnants of the Stone Age, in the sense of being frozen at an earlier technological moment. They are communities that have been continuously developing, continuously adapting, continuously responding to their environment for thousands of years. Their technology is appropriate to their environment in a way that the technological assumptions of the outside world are not. A GPS device is useless in a forest, where you can navigate by tree species and bird behavior and the direction of water flow. A gun requires ammunition that must be manufactured far away and transported. A blowpipe with curare-tipped darts is made from materials available in the forest and is, in its ecological context, a more functional and sustainable technology. The community that exists in a specific forest and has developed the specific knowledge of that forest over thousands of years is not technologically primitive. It is technologically specialized in a way that the outside world's general-purpose technologies cannot replicate. The languages spoken in the blank space, the ones that Funai and linguistics researchers have been able to partially document through careful observation at the edges, are in many cases unrelated to any known language family. Linguistic isolates, languages that do not derive from the same root as any other documented language. Each such language is not just a communication system. It is a conceptual universe, a way of organizing reality that is specific to the community that developed it, that encodes particular observations about the natural world, particular social structures, particular ways of understanding time and space and relationship. When a language disappears, the conceptual universe it represents disappears with it. The world literally knows less, And the blank space contains, in the languages of its communities, conceptual universes that the outside world does not even know it is missing. Now let us go to the specific geography, because there are particular rivers and particular territories in the blank space that have their own stories, their own textures, their own records of encounter and resistance that bring this abstract situation into concrete focus. The Javari Valley, which we have already mentioned, is the largest and most intensively studied of the uncontacted territories, precisely because it is the most important. The rivers of the Javari Valley, the Javari itself, the Itwi, the Itacoai, the Xutai, the smaller tributaries whose Portuguese names on maps give way to indigenous names where anyone knows them at all, are the highways of a world that runs on different principles than the world outside. The seasonality of the Amazon, the extraordinary alternation between flood season and dry season, when rivers rise by 10 and 15 and sometimes 20 meters, and the forests flood and become navigable by canoe for hundreds of kilometers, into territory that is dry land for the other half of the year, creates a temporal rhythm that organizes everything in the communities that live there. The timing of planting and harvesting, the movement between high-ground villages and low-ground fishing and gathering areas, the scheduling of ceremonies and the social gatherings that depend on specific resources being available. The Funai Protection Team in the Javari Valley, the Frente de Proteção Etnoambiental Javari, is one of the most experienced groups of indigenous rights practitioners in the world. The team includes not just government agents, but indigenous people from contacted groups in the valley who serve as intermediaries, translators, and sources of local knowledge. Their work is not visible. It does not produce dramatic footage. It consists of patrols, of evidence documentation, of the filing of legal complaints against encroachers, of the constant, exhausting work of maintaining a boundary around a blank space against the pressure of forces that are better resourced and less bound by the law than the people trying to protect them. In 2021, Bruno Pereira, a veteran Funai official, who had spent much of his career working to protect uncontacted peoples in the Javari Valley, was working in the territory with the British journalist Dom Phillips, who was researching a book on the Amazon. Both men were murdered by illegal fishermen operating in the indigenous territory. Their killings shocked the world briefly and then faded from international attention, as news does. But for the people working in the Javari Valley, for the communities they were protecting, for the history of the blank space, the murders were something else. They were the violent endpoint of a logic that runs from illegal resource extraction through the intimidation of those who resist it to the elimination of the most effective resistors. Pereira knew the Javari Valley better than almost any living outsider. He knew where the uncontacted groups were. He knew the routes and the patterns and the threats. He was murdered because that knowledge and his willingness to act on it made him dangerous to the people destroying the territory. The blank space, in the end, is not just a cartographic convention. It is not just a policy framework. It is not just a biodiversity reserve. It is the address of people. People with names and languages the outside world does not know. People with histories that stretch back thousands of years. People who have made a choice, conscious or inherited or both, to remain apart from a world that demonstrated its intentions clearly enough, several hundred years ago, that the lesson has not been forgotten. The blank space is the residue of that lesson, maintained on maps by cartographers who understand that sometimes the most honest thing you can put on a map is nothing, and the blank space is shrinking. This is the fact that sits behind everything else and refuses to be comfortable. The deforestation data is clear. The encroachment reports are clear. The murders of indigenous rights defenders. Brazil has one of the highest rates of killing of environmental and indigenous rights defenders in the world, are clear. The trajectory, absent serious and sustained intervention, is toward a blank space that fills in not with knowledge but with loss. That fills in not with the details of a living community, but with the details of a cattle ranch and a soy field and a gold mining operation, and the memory, fading, of what was there before. There are people working against this trajectory. The Funai protection teams, the indigenous rights lawyers, the environmental prosecutors, the community members of contacted indigenous groups who act as the most effective advocates for their uncontacted neighbors, knowing as they do what the alternative looks like. The international indigenous rights organizations, the researchers and journalists who document the situation and make it visible. These people exist. Their work matters. In specific cases, their work has made a concrete difference. Territorial demarcation that happened because of their advocacy has protected communities. Legal injunctions that stopped specific mining or logging operations were won by their efforts. The blank space is smaller than it would have been without them. They deserve more support and more attention than they receive. But the work of protection is permanent, because the pressures are permanent. The gold does not disappear because it is in a protected territory. The timber does not stop being valuable. The land does not stop being desirable for agriculture. The economic forces that are eating into the blank space are structural and continuous, and resisting them requires structural and continuous effort from the other direction. There is no permanent solution. There is only the ongoing work. Let us take a step back from the immediacy of the crisis for a moment and think about what the blank space means philosophically, because it means something beyond the immediate politics, beyond the conservation argument, beyond even the human rights framework, important as all of those are. The existence of the blank space tells us something about the limits of the modern world's understanding of itself. We live in an age that has produced more information, more documentation, more mapping of the physical and social world than any previous era in human history. We have satellites that can read a number plate from orbit. We have sensors distributed across every ocean, measuring temperature and salinity in real time. We have genomics that can reconstruct the migration patterns of human populations across 50,000 years of prehistory. We have produced, in other words, a civilization that believes very strongly in the completeness of its knowledge and the universality of its frameworks. And in the middle of a continent that has been theoretically known to the outside world for 5 centuries, there is a blank space. A significant, persistent, legally protected blank space where people live in ways that the outside world has not been able to document, in languages the